I never thought I would live to see such shame carried out in broad daylight. But that afternoon in the central square, under a sun so heavy it seemed to press against our skulls, 3 families, families who once held their heads high, even in poverty, stood exposed, stripped of dignity. On the surface, they pretended their desperate act was justified, that it was about honor and saving face. But everyone knew the truth crawling beneath. They were drowning not in honor, but in debts. Debts of gambling, debts of bottles emptied night after night, debts of pride wounded and swollen. And they had found the cheapest coin to pay it with: their own daughters. The square usually hummed with the chatter of vendors, the splash of children at the fountain, the hushed gossip of neighbors. But not on that day. That day the air was thick, and silence clung to every wall. People gathered shoulder to shoulder, lining the plaza. Some craned their necks with morbid curiosity, others looked away, embarrassed at their own presence there. It felt as though simply attending was complicity, yet no one left. In the center stood the girls, 3 of them, so young you could still see childhood in their faces, though it was hidden now beneath fear. They trembled like sparrows caught in sudden rain. One pressed a bundle against her chest wrapped in worn cloth. Something personal, perhaps a last tie to the life she was being robbed of. Another buried her face in the crook of her elbow, ashamed even to meet the eyes of the people who had come to watch her humiliation. The third fixed her gaze on the ground, as if willing it to crack and swallow her whole, to hide her in the earth, rather than let her be seen this way. Then he arrived. The chief, proud, grand, astride a white horse as if he were a conqueror returning to parade his spoils. He was a large man, chest puffed out, his thick voice strong enough to scatter pigeons from the rooftops. Children who once played freely in alleyways went rigid when they heard his laugh. Even the stray dogs held their tongues. When he raised his hand to make the opening bid, the silence was so absolute, it seemed as though the entire square was holding one breath. Even the leaves of the mango trees at the far end rustled softly, like nervous whispers. No one dared cut across. No one lifted a hand to stop him. His bid was not measured, not cautious, not respectful. He declared loudly that he would take all 3 at once, speaking of them not as people but as things, sacks of grain or crates of corn that could be bundled together and carted off. He had no shame. He announced it boldly. These girls would go to his house, be given to his 3 sons as wives. He pronounced it with pride, as though he had performed a service to the village, as though he were the savior of their honor. And then, as if sealing the weight of invisible chains around their wrists and throats, the crowd applauded. Some clapped with vigor, eager to be seen supporting the most powerful man in town. Others offered only the barest pat of palms, reluctant but afraid to show refusal. Those who did not clap tried to hide, eyes dropping to the earth, faces turned to the hedges, shame curled into their shoulders. No one wanted to see the tears-burning tracks down the girls' cheeks. No one wanted to be pierced by their silence. No one wanted to bear the contamination of the parents' betrayal. The walk to the chief's estate was slow, painful. Dust rose on the road as the 3 trailed behind him, their steps heavy, their hearts emptier still. Their greatest fear wasn't the looming sons to whom they had been promised, nor even the brute man leading their captivity. No, their true fear was sharper. That their families, the ones meant to shield them, had bartered away their worth for debts not of their making. That wound cut deeper than any whip. It hollowed their chests into tombs, leaving them abandoned before ever stepping inside the gates of the great house. The village whispered as they vanished into the horizon, the dust lingering like a ghost. Everyone understood, even if they didn't speak it, that the fiercest pain did not stem from visible chains, or from the chief's booming voice, but from the silent consent of their parents, who said without words, "You are worth less than what I owe." That single wound stripped them of more than liberty. It stripped them of identity. At the chief's compound, a wooden gate creaked, its groan heavy and ominous, as though the wood itself mourned what it was forced to contain. The facade of the house gleamed white, decorated with dried flowers stacked neatly at the entry like offerings. But the smell, it betrayed everything. A stale, unshakable stench of power long abused. A musk built not on honor or respect, but on fear burned into the clay walls. The chief dismounted with a practiced thud, brushing dust from his trousers and extending his arms theatrically. In a booming voice he declared their arrival. "My daughters, my blessings, my gift to purify the blood of this home." His words reverberated against stone, echoing down corridors, shaking inescapably through the yard. The servants came next. Young women with eyes too tired for their age, carrying water basins and folded cloths. Some looked with pity so fleeting it was hidden quickly behind lowered lashes. Others watched with envy, as if believing better to be chosen property than forgotten shadows. Their hands twitched restlessly, gripping buckets, cloths, tools, unsure whether to help or to turn away. The girls stepped down one by one. The first was trembling so hard her knees struck each other like hollow wood. The second clutched a ribbon at her wrist, faded blue but fiercely held, as though it contained every memory still pure in her life. The third dragged her feet, eyes like extinguished lanterns, carrying not resistance but exhaustion older than her years. From the back of the yard, hymns began. Women's voices carried melodies meant to sound joyous, but rang hollow instead, brittle and false. They called it a blessing feast, but each syllable cracked like dry clay. The chief, reveling like a one-man chorus, lifted his arms again and roared, "Grace has filled my house! These girls will carry my name, strengthen my lineage, preserve my honor." His voice struck the walls like thunder, but the silence of the three women was louder still. Guided into tidy rooms with embroidered sheets, they were told, "This is your place now, daughters." But those words branded deeper than iron. They were not daughters anymore. They were possessions. When one stumbled on a rug inside the hall, the chief yanked her upright with careless force, shaking her like one shakes a scrawny chicken. Her eyes drifted far beyond him, far beyond the room, perhaps back to the lullaby her mother once sang, perhaps to the yard where she once played, a place where she had been someone, not something. Another girl stared at the portraits lining the walls, frames gilded with images of the chief smiling next to politicians. Trophies in hand, spotlight in his eyes. Here was a man who placed his pride above God, above people, above love itself. She realized then that this house was not just her physical prison. It would be her spiritual one too, and the third girl closed her eyes, clutching that ribbon until blood drained from her fingers. In her silence she prayed, not for freedom, not even for mercy, but to wake up in another world where she was not reduced to a tool for someone else's legacy. The blessing banquet was laid out in the hall. Fruit piled high, cakes untouched, platters of meats glistening in oil. It was abundance without flavor, generosity without heart. Food meant to impress dignitaries who would never taste it. A parody of joy. The chief ordered them inspected like livestock. He squeezed their arms, tilted their faces side to side, measured their height and weight with his gaze. A ritual humiliation dressed as ceremony. When done, he clapped his hands, smiling too widely, and demanded songs fill the air once more. Voices rose, thin and spiritless, echoing like the voices of ghosts. And that night, with rooms prepared and smiles forced, the girls came to understand what prison truly was. It wasn't just the walls, or the barred gates, or even the man's booming presence. It was the very air soaked with domination. It was the gaze that followed them, the hush when they passed. It was being erased by silence. On the porch, the chief raised his arms in triumph and bellowed into the night. "They are the new hope. My name will never die." His words echoed outward, rattling against trees and houses, but nature itself seemed to spit them back. And while the village beyond sank into silence, inside that house, no one dreamed peacefully. No one truly slept. Because while the village fell into silence, each of the three lay on a soft mattress. But their hearts remained back there in the yard in the old hammock on the riverbank, where they once saw their reflections, before everything turned into merchandise. And so ended the first day in the big house with a roof over their heads, but no sky to dream under, the body there, but the soul wandering through the corners, searching for an embrace that had already been sold, a love that would never arrive the same way again. The next day the sun seemed twice as heavy in the yard. The heat spread like a thick hand, pressing down on the head of anyone who dared step out of the shade. The smell of burnt grass mixed with the dust kicked up by passing horses and everything. They seemed to want to silence anyone who tried to speak of pain. It was in that suffocating heat that the girls saw, for the first time, the chief's sons up close. In broad daylight, they came one by one, as if they didn't want to be seen. Together, each carrying on his face a poorly told story. Thealdest, called Baraka, was almost 30, with a strong body, but eyes that always wandered to the ground. He carried a short sword at his waist, inherited from his grandfather, and fiddled with it as if trying to protect himself from the world. When he looked at the first girl, it was as if he were facing an object too heavy to carry. He looked away, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and pretended to adjust his belt strap. The second son, named Quito, arrived with his head held high, but with a contained rage burning deep in his eyes. The servant said he was the chief's favorite because he had hot blood and never questioned an order. But there, in front of the girls, he didn't know what to do with his hands. He held the edge of the cloth on his shoulder, pulled at loose threads, bit his tongue. When the second girl looked up at him, she found only a void deeper than a moonless night. It was as if he wanted to scream but was trapped in a deep well. The third son, named Mosey, was the youngest, still with a boy's face, but eyes as cold as stagnant water. He entered the big hole, dragging his sandals unhurried like someone going to the chicken coop to fetch corn. He passed by the third girl without even turning his head. He grabbed a gourd of water, drank slowly, wiped his mouth with his arm and left. He left no words, no glance, no trace of human warmth. In that moment, the three girls understood that the prison wasn't only theirs. The sons were also trapped, each in their own invisible chains. One dominated by the fear of disappointing the father, another by the rage of never having been loved, and the last by the indifference of someone who had given up on feeling anything at all. Baraka spent the afternoon in the yard sharpening his sword, but the sound of stone against metal felt like a contained cry. From time to time he looked toward the house as if expecting to see his dead mother come out of the door, telling him to drop that and come eat. But the mother was no longer there and no one called. Silence was his only companion. Cato, the middle one, wandered around the yard, kicking stones, peeking into windows. When he passed near the girls, he took deep breaths. His shoulders lifted as if he wanted to say something but swallowed it at the last second. Once he almost said, "I'm sorry," but the words died in his throat, choked by the same rage that kept him standing. Mosey disappeared into the woods, stayed gone all day. He returned at dusk, his clothes dirty with mud, smelling of leaves, and his eyes emptier than before. When he came in, he dropped his sandals at the door, went straight to his room, and lay down without even brushing off the dust. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't break anything. He simply existed like a forgotten stone on the path. The girls strapped in the hallways of the big house watched everything through cracks, through reflections in water buckets, through the cook's whispers. With each movement from the sons, they understood more about their captivity. It wasn't a prison with bars, but a prison made of expectations. Silence inherited shame. One night, the youngest of the girls heard Baraka crying alone in the yard. The sound was low, like a wounded dog. He trembled, clutching his sword, murmuring words no one would understand. When he realized he was being watched, he stopped, wiped his face in anger, and went back inside. Deep in his eyes, there was a boy asking for comfort, but his hardened face erased any trace of tenderness. Quito began to beat one of the horses in the stable for no reason. The animal neighed, tried to escape, but Quito seemed to be unloading. All therage he couldn't direct at his father. The cooks covered their ears and the guards pretended not to see. Afterwards, he would come out with his hands covered in blood, sit on the edge of the well, and stare at his own reflection as if he wanted to drown right there. Mosey only looked at the stars. He would lie on the roof, stretched out, talking to himself, sometimes laughing softly. He didn't care about his father's shouts, nor about the orders. It was as if he had disconnected from the world the moment his mother died, and each of his laughs was a warning that the emptiness had completely taken over. The big house was a silent battlefield. The chief paced back and forth, watching every corner, every breath. He ordered banquets to be prepared, weddings to be planned, as if he could force his son's will by sheer force. But with each empty gaze, with each dragged step, his proud empire began to show cracks. The girls, even imprisoned, felt compassion, a bitter compassion. There was no love, no gratitude, but there was a shared pain, a recognition that everyone there carried open scars. And perhaps that was the chief's greatest punishment, to discover that behind the high walls and speeches of honor, there was no family, no affection, only a sad theater with broken characters. At nightfall, lamps were lit, filling the hallways with shadows that danced like spirits. The girls retreated to their rooms, each embracing her own fear, and deep inside, a voiceless question hammered in each chest. How far does a man's prison go? How deep is the pain of a son who was never loved? That night no one truly slept. The chief dreamed of applause that never came. The sons, each in their corner, wrestled with old ghosts. And the girls, curled up on cold beds, prayed silently, not to be saved, but so as not to completely lose the last piece of themselves they still kept in their chests. The house breathed deeply as if about to explode. But for now, there was only silence. And within that silence, each soul wandered, searching for a bit of light that had been extinguished long before everything began. The next day dawned with a hot wind that cut the face like a dull knife. The sky looked heavy, and the chickens pecked slowly, as if they too sensed that something wrong was haunting the yard. In the kitchen, the pots had been boiling since early morning. The smell of stewed meat, cassava, rich beans, and fried bananas spread throughout the entire house. But there was no joy in the air. It was a sad perfume, a smell of a forced feast, as if they were trying to plug the hole of a wound with flour and salt. The chief ordered the large table to be set, the one only used on days of important visits, or when politicians from the city came. He commanded the cutlery to be polished, embroidered tablecloths to be laid out, and fruits to be arranged in tall baskets, as if trying to convince himself that his house was worthy of respect. But everything there was hollow. The three girls were called to the hall. They wore dresses they didn't choose, ironed by the maids. The fabric was beautiful, but on their bodies it felt like a heavy armor. Every step toward the table was a silent confession of defeat. When they arrived, they stood still, waiting for orders, as if they had already forgotten how to sit without permission. The chief pointed brusquely to the seats, and the three sat side by side. The sons were already there. Baraka played with his glass of water, unable to raise his head. Kido, the middle one, bit his nails, tapped his feet on the floor, and stared at the ceiling as if he wanted to make a hole and escape. Mosey, the youngest, rested his head in his hand, watching the flies move, not caring about anything. When the chief sat at the head of the table, the whole room seemed to shrink. He clapped his hands twice, and the maids began to bring in steaming trays. They placed full plates, filled glasses, scattered flour, salt and pepper, but no one spoke. The clinking of cutlery against the plates was the only sound that existed. The girls looked at the food with empty eyes. The smell of rich meat reminded them of village feast days, when they still ran free, when they could still laugh by the riverbank, when they still believed the world held a place for them. Now each bite was a punch to the memory. The first girl tried to bring a piece of cassava to her mouth, but her hand trembled so much the fork fell onto the plate. The second looked at the fried banana and remembered the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the gentle songs that lulled the afternoons, and a tear fell straight into her plate, mixing with the meat broth. The third just stared at the table, breathing deeply, as if she wanted to disappear right there. The chief let out a laugh that echoed off the walls. He laughed loudly, slapping the table as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world, but no one joined in. Baraka closed his eyes. Kido held his breath. Mosey didn't even move. It was a lonely laugh, a sound that revealed more despair than joy. Then the chief started a speech between bites. He talked about tradition, about honor, about the greatness of his name. He said that those girls should feel privileged, that fate had chosen them for a divine mission. Every word was a new knife stabbed into the silence. The girls shrank in their chairs, trying not to breathe loudly, trying to disappear into the embroidered tablecloth. One of them wiped her face, hiding the tears discreetly, but the chief saw. He pointed his finger, laughed even louder, and said, "Cry. A good woman cries in the beginning, but later learns to be grateful." No one dared to contradict him. The maids moved lightly, not lifting their eyes. One almost dropped a water pitcher, so tense was the air. The room felt heavy, as if every wall was holding back an unscreed shout, every painting trembling in fear of falling. Dot. At one point, the second girl stood up abruptly, as if a bug had bitten her leg. But before she could leave, the chief slammed the table, ordering her to sit. She obeyed, but her gaze drifted far away beyond the window, where Thesky was already turning orange. Perhaps she remembered afternoons when she ran in the yard, unaware of what it meant to fear a man, or feel ashamed of existing. Dinner continued like that, a silent torment. Every chew was a reminder of stolen freedom. Every sip of juice was a slow drowning. The chief kept talking, praising himself, exalting the future grandchildren who didn't yet exist. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with a napkin, stood up triumphantly, and looked down at the girls. He said that from then on every night would be like that. Family unity, abundance, and silence. He ordered them to stand, thank for the meal, and withdraw to their rooms. They stood slowly, their legs heavy, as if they had carried sacks of stones all day. As they left, their eyes met for a moment. No words were spoken, but in that instant, a silent understanding was born. None of them was alone in that hell, even without touching, even without speaking. They knew they shared the same open wound. That night, when they shut themselves in their rooms, each lay down with an empty stomach. Despite the abundant table, the food still lingered in the air. But there was no strength to swallow. One of them bit the sheet to keep from screaming. Another prayed softly, asking God not to let the last thread of hope die. And the third, curled up at the edge of the bed, whispered her grandmother's name as if calling for salvation. Outside, the chief lit a cigarette and stood looking out at the yard, satisfied. To him, everything was going according to plan. 3 wives, 3 future heirs, an entire village bent to his power. But inside, in the locked rooms, a seed was sprouting that he could never imagine. In the muffled silence of that night, each heartbeat was a silent vow that one day, even if it took time, even if it cost blood and tears, that big table would not be the end of the story. It would only be the beginning of something much greater than any banquet. Because those who learn to swallow their pain in silence also learn to wait for the right moment to return the scream to the world. That night, the wind blowing through the window seemed to carry ancient voices, forgotten songs, the smell of wet earth. Every room in the big house was plunged into a silence so deep, you could hear the creaking of the wood, the rustling of the leaves outside, the distant lament of a frog in the marsh. But inside the girls' heads, silence did not exist. Their longing was a raging river running wild, crashing against the banks of memory. The first girl, lying on a bed that felt more like a cold altar, started dreaming even before fully falling asleep. Her body was there, but her spirit was already running free. In the dream, she saw herself small again, running in the yard after the chickens, laughing with her mouth wide open, her feet dirty with mud. In the corner of the yard, sitting on a wooden chair, her grandmother sang a slow song, one of those songs only someone who carries a lifetime in their soul can sing. The old woman, her white hair braided, clapped her hands slowly, and the girl spun around, twirling as if she had no weight in the world. The smell of coffee brewing over the wood fire mixed with a scent of orange blossoms falling from the tree. It was the smell of life, a smell that said, "You belong here." In the dream, the girl ran to her grandmother's lap, lay her head on her sunken chest, and felt her heart beating slow and steady. But when she tried to speak, no sound came out. The grandmother looked at her tenderly, but her lips didn't move. The silence was more painful than any slap. The girl woke up with a start, her breath cut short, her face wet with tears. She got up, went to the window, and saw the sky filled with stars like a blanket full of holes. Out there, life went on, but inside her, everything was frozen in that embrace. She would never feel again. In the next room, the second girl also wrestled with her own longing. Her dream began with her father's voice, the father who was once gentle before he was defeated by alcohol and gambling. She remembered the day he carried her on his shoulders to the river, showing her the little fish, teaching her which leaves were good for tea and which ones could make you sick. In the dream, the father smiled, a wide smile, his teeth stained from tobacco, but full of truth. He would say, "Daughter, you're my piece of light," and she believed him. In the dream, she saw herself walking along the riverbank. The sun setting, dragonflies dancing on the water's surface. The father would extend his hand, hold hers tight like someone promising never to let go. But suddenly his hand slipped away. He turned his back and walked off, disappearing into the tall grass. She ran, screamed, but couldn't reach him. The water rose, soaked her feet. Her dress reached her chest. Panic took over. She woke up gasping, clutching the sheet, her nails digging into the fabric. Her chest hurt as if someone had punched it hard. The third girl, the quietest one, slept facing the wall. Her dream was less clear, but no less painful. She was in the yard on an afternoon of gentle rain, the ground smelling of fresh mud. The sound of raindrops hitting the leaves was a soft song, almost a prayer. She smelled roasted corn coming from the stove, heard her aunts singing as they prepared bread dough, their idle chatter filling the air with human warmth. In the dream, she walked barefoot, her wet hair stuck to her face, and each step was a return to something long lost. At one moment, she looked back and saw the old house, its cracked walls but full of life. She saw her mother at the window, hand raised in a shy wave. But when she tried to run back, the house began to fade like smoke carried by the wind. The ground opened in muddy halls and she sank. Sank until she saw nothing. She woke up drenched in sweat, her hands cold, her lips trembling. She lay still, listening to her heartbeat in the dark. Each beat was a hammer blow to her chest, reminding her there was no going back. Longing was a creature that bites slowly, chewing memories patiently until it takes away all the strength from the one who dreams. In the big house, the night dragged on. The chief slept soundly in his wide room, his snoring echoing down the halls like lazy thunder. The sons, each in his own room, also wrestled with their own ghosts. But the girls were in another war, the war against longing. It was a longing too big to fit into any word. It wasn't just the absence of the smell of home or someone's embrace. It was the absence of themselves, of the girl who once ran free, of the body that had never known strange hands, of the soul that believed in love. It was a longing that screamed deep in their throats, but never came out because they had already learned that screaming didn't change fate. There, in the locked rooms, Each one clung to a piece of the past, as if holding a broken talisman. If not for the memories, they might have already died inside. But it was precisely that longing that kept the last thread of hope alive, like an ember hidden beneath the ashes. And when dawn came, leaving the sky gray and a damp air clinging to their skin, the three rose slowly, without the courage to look at their own reflections in the water jars. Each one carefully made her bed as if apologizing to the fabric. Their hands trembled. Their sunken eyes seemed to have aged years in a single night. But beneath the pain, something small began to grow. A silent desire not to forget who they were, to keep every smell, every voice, every piece of memory that the chief could never buy. Because as long as longing lived, they still owned some part of themselves. And no one, not even the richest or cruelest man, could auction that away. That morning there was no clear revolt yet, no escape plan. There was only longing, but a longing so live it could be heard in the silence. And sometimes the deepest silence carries the loudest scream. That was how the night closed. 3 hearts beating in the dark, each one calling back a past that should never have been sold. The sun had barely risen when the hoarse crow of the rooster cut through the heavy silence of the big house. The yard was still asleep. The trees sighed with dew, and the smell of wet grass rose from the ground like an ancient lament. Inside the rooms, the girls were already awake, their eyes red, their souls shriveled. That morning, something inside them changed, as if the last drop had finally spilled over. The eldest was the first to whisper in a thread of voice that seemed to come from another life. "What if we left? What if we ran out before the day?" Caesar's, the others didn't answer right away. Fear tied them up inside, but the desire for freedom burned like a buried ember. After a few long seconds, their heads nodded insolence, and the plan took shape, crooked and urgent. Like everything born out of despair, they knew the back fence, the one separating the house from the dense woods, was lower and less guarded. Over the days, they had overheard the guards whispering, talking about holes in the fence, fallen branches. They also knew the exact time the dogs were fed and locked up a short window. But it could be their only chance. That dawn, while the chieftains still slept deep in their nightmares, and the chief himself snored like lazy thunder, the girls got up. Their bare feet touched the cold floor, their bodies trembling, not only from fear, but also from courage. Every step was a blow against their imposed fate. When they reached the hallway, they looked back one last time. They saw therald mats, the half-filled water jars, the sheets stained with tears. Each object seemed to whisper, "Stay!" like a cursed spell. But they kept going, stuck to each other, breathing so quietly it was as if the air itself wanted to help. Dot in the yard. The wet grass clung to their ankles, and the night seemed to hold its breath. They passed by the chicken coop, dodged the pots left outside until they saw the fence. There it was, half collapsed, covered with vines and dry leaves. Their hearts pounded so loudly it sounded like drums in the dark. The first girl grabbed the wire, pulled hard, opened a gap. The others slipped through quickly, as if their lives depended on that single breath. When the last girl began to cross, the sound of a breaking branch echoed like thunder. One of the dogs, even though locked up, lifted its head and barked. The sound cut the air like a knife. The girls ran, but the barking woke the guards. One stumbled out, lantern in hand, shouting words like spears. Another appeared with a baton, running toward the fence. The girls plunged into the woods, scratching their arms, tearing their dresses. The damp ground sucked at their feet. The thorns ripped their skin. Even so, they ran. They ran as if running back to a womb, to a mother's belly, to any place far from that hell. But the woods were dense, full of treacherous roots, and fear was stronger than strength. When they reached the edge of a stream, panting, they saw lantern lights cutting through the darkness behind them. There was nowhere to go. The river was deep, the banks slippery. They looked at each other, and in that instant, they knew the dream had ended before it even began. The guards approached, shouting threats. One grabbed the first girl by her hair. Another pushed the second against a tree. The third fell to her knees, hugging her chest as if trying to protect the last bit of dignity that still pulsed inside. There was no fight, only mute sobs, a dry cry older than the world. They were dragged back one by one. The way back was a procession of shame. Leaves stuck to their hair, feet wounded, faces covered in mud and thin blood. When they passed through the big house gate, the chief was already waiting. Standing there, hands clasped behind his back, his face lit by a torch. He didn't speak at first. He paced in circles, breathing heavily like a bull ready to charge. Then he stopped in front of the first girl, lifted her face with the tip of his baton. Her eyes were empty like a dry well. He smiled, a cold smile, and said, "Escape is not for weak women. Here you will learn that freedom has a high price, and you can't afford it." He ordered them to be locked up, each in a different room, so they could learn to value the house that took them in. They were dragged down the dark hallways, not allowed to say goodbye. Each was thrown into a small room with a thin mat, a bowl of water, and a bucket for needs. The door slammed shut with a crash. The sound echoed like a sentence. Inside, time became the enemy. The hours crawled like a lazy snake. The silence, once a companion, now turned into a jailer. The only sounds were the heartbeat, the creak of the wood, and sometimes the sob caught in the throat. There was no conversation, no comfort, no solace. Hunger came quickly. Thirst gnawed at their throats, but fear was stronger. Each one locked in her own solitude began to remember the moment. She was handed over at the auction. The question arose, cruel, when exactly did they start being abandoned? It wasn't on the day of the auction. It wasn't when the chief struck the gavel. It was much earlier. It was in the first look that didn't see them, in the first hug that didn't need warmth, in the first word that cut instead of mending. The days passed slowly. Their bodies weakened, their minds blurred, but deep down something remained alive. The memory of who they were, and no matter how thick the walls were, each one held inside a spark, small, almost invisible, but capable of setting the whole world on fire if fed. When finally the doors opened, their eyes were sunken. Their hands trembled, but their souls, that soul that had seemed buried, was still there. They didn't come out intact, but they didn't come out dead either. They walked out without looking at each other, but each carrying the same vow inside. Never again give away the little they still had left. When they returned to the common space, there were no hugs or words, only looks that said everything. Saw your pain and you saw mine. And in that silent recognition, a new strength was born. A strength the chief would never understand because it couldn't be bought, tamed, or beaten with a club. There, in the failure of their first escape, they learned a harsh truth. The greatest prison was not in the house, but in the bond their families had severed when they sold them. And understanding that was the first step, not toward fleeing, but toward rebuilding themselves from the inside out. While the chief celebrated his silent victory, unaware that the external chains were the weakest ones. Inside those three, a slow, silent courage was stitching itself together like a root piercing the ground. Because even in darkness, there is always a root searching for light, and they, without even knowing it, were already growing far beyond the walls that confined them. Days started flowing again in the big house, but not like before. After the failed escape, the girls moved like shadows, each step carrying the weight of a world that no longer belonged to them. The chief, feeling victorious, walked through the hallways with his head held high, tapping his baton on the ground with each step as if marking the rhythm of everyone's breath. The sons kept to themselves, each one wrestling with his own ghosts. The girls went back to their forced tasks, cleaning, sewing, serving at the table. The glances they exchanged were quick but deep, filled with silent promises. In between chores, their thoughts drifted far away back to the woods, the river, the hands that once held them with care. But there was a deeper wound that had yet to be opened. One afternoon, while the second girl swept the hallway leading to the chief's room, she noticed a half-clothed trunk piled among sacks of corn and baskets of laundry. The wood was chipped, the metal fittings rusted, as if it were an object forgotten by time. Something pulled her closer, like a whisper coming from the walls. She approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. With trembling hands, she pushed the lid open. Inside there were old clothes, worn-out boots, and a pile of crumpled papers, some burned at the edges. She picked up a stack of letters, wrinkled, the paper yellowed with time. At first she couldn't understand. The words danced before her eyes, but then she recognized a name, a handwriting. It was her mother's name. She felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. Her legs gave out. She sat on the cold floor, breathing like someone struggling not to drown. She read each line, each curve of the handwriting, and her world shattered into pieces with every word. Honored Chief, I accept your proposal. I trust my daughter will find a dignified future in your house. I send this letter to confirm the agreed amount. Another letter from another mother. Debt consumes me. I agree to sell my girl. May God protect her, for I no longer can. And another, the family's honor must be kept, even if it costs my daughter's blood. Receive her as a wife for your son. The sob came dry at first, a mute shudder shaking her chest. Then her throat opened and the lament came out as a sad, ancient chant that echoed down the hallway. The other girls heard it, ran over and found her on her knees, clutching the letters, her eyes wide, her face wet with pain. The first girl took one of the letters in her hands. As she read it, it felt like a knife slashing her belly. She remembered her mother sitting on the doorstep, the heavy silence in her eyes. Now it all made sense. The cold hug, the quick farewell, the averted gaze on the day of the auction. It hadn't been a moment of despair, but a calculated decision. The third girl couldn't hold back the scream. She fell to the ground, her whole body trembling, mumbling, incoherent words, calling for her grandmother, for the father who never returned. The floor seemed to suck out her strength. The air vanished, her chest burned. There, in the dim hallway, they understood the truth that hurt more than any chain. They hadn't just been sold. They had been betrayed. Betrayed by the very people who should have been their safe harbor. Betrayed by those who brought them into the world with promises of protection. The pain of being auctioned by the chief was already cruel. But discovering that the sale started at home tore the soul in a way no prayer or time could fix. While they wept, the second girl, in a silent act of fury, began tearing the letters. But the first girl grabbed her hand. "Don't tear them. We need to remember. We need to carry this truth so they can never say we made it up." Her voice came out low, tired, but firm. It was the first time one of them spoke with such strength. The chief appeared in the hallway, drawn by the noise. When he saw the letters scattered, his face turned red, his eyes bulged, the vein in his neck pulsed. He lunged at the girls, pulled at the letters, tried to snatch them away, but they held on tight. The third girl, her hair disheveled, looked straight into his eyes for the first time. A look that asked for nothing. No mercy, no explanation. It was a look that spat truth. The chief shouted, called for the guards, but the sons didn't come. Baraka locked himself in his room. Keto pretended to sleep. Mosey disappeared into the woods. For the first time, he was alone in his authority, holding pieces of paper that had become sharp spears against his pride. The girls were dragged back to their rooms, but something had changed. The chief ordered the letters to be burned in the yard in front of everyone to erase the evidence. But as the flames rose, the fire reflected in their eyes. And in that reflection, there was a silent promise. You can burn the paper, but no one can take the memory. That night, the smell of burned paper spread through the house, seeping into every crack, every corner. To the chief, it was a sign of victory, of control. To the girls, it smelled like a funeral, not theirs, but of the last bit of lies that still tied their hearts to their parents. When they retired, each lay down on the hard floor, refusing the bed. It was as if their bodies needed to feel the earth's coldness to remember they were still alive, still had roots. In their eyes, there was no longer only pain. There was fury, a quiet, mature fury that didn't explode all at once, but grew inside like a root-splitting stone. What was once submission turned into heavy silence. What was once resignation turned into a hidden flame. And even locked up, each heartbeat announced that the dark night wouldn't last forever. Because a woman who discovers betrayal in her blood learns to never again wait for salvation from outside, she learns to become her own fortress. In that stifling hallway, not just 3 betrayed girls were born, but 3 roots ready to break through the ground. And no matter how much the letters turned to ash, the truth had already been planted in the only place fire can't reach, inside their chests. The nights came heavy in the big house like a thick blanket thrown over each soul. Silence stopped being just the absence of sound. It became a living presence, breathing in the hallway, listening behind doors. After the episode with the burnt letters, the air grew even denser, and no one moved without feeling the weight of invisible eyes, as if each wall held a secret, ready to explode. The chief's sons, once obedient shadows, began to show cracks. Baraka, the eldest, walked around the yard, dragging his sword, but not to sharpen it. He dragged it as if it were a burden, a dead weight that served no purpose anymore. He would sit on the trunk of the old cashew tree, bang the blade against the ground, look at Thesky, and murmur things not even the birds understood. Sometimes he cried silently, tears mixing with sweat and the dust of the yard. Keto, the middle one, spent his hours pacing circles in the corral, kicking stones, breaking branches, destroying nests. A brute fury took hold of him, but inside there was only emptiness. His face, marked with small scars from old fights, carried the expression of someone tired of war. When he passed the girls in the hallway, he lowered his eyes. One day, he almost let slip an apology, but he bit his lips until they bled. Mosi, the youngest, simply disappeared. He would vanish into the woods, spend the whole day out, returning only when the moon was high. People said he slept under trees, talked to the stars, threw stones into the river until his hands turned purple. When he came back, he barely looked at anyone, as if he had become a spirit, more animal than man. It was on a suffocating night when the moon looked like a smoky lamp in the sky that Keto finally broke. He found the second girl on the porch, sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, staring at the horizon. The silence was so thick it felt like the entire world held its breath to listen. Keto stopped, hesitated, took a step back, but she didn't move, didn't turn her face. It was as if she already knew. He approached slowly, each step an unspoken apology he didn't know how to say. He sat on the ground far enough away to respect her space. He spent a long time looking at his own hands, full of calluses, his nails dirty. Then he spoke in a hoarse-broken voice. I never wanted this. I never wanted any woman. I just wanted to prove to my father that I was a man. She didn't reply right away. The wind swayed her hair, bringing the smell of the woods, the distant sound of frogs in the marsh. When she spoke, it was low, but so clear it sounded like a bell ringing in the night. Being a man isn't about taking a woman. Being a man is about protecting. Quito trembled. He clenched his fists, breathing like someone trying to pull air from the bottom of a well. The tears came, first hidden, then open. His crying was ugly, raw, like he was vomiting years of fear, anger, and shame. The girl stayed still. Her look wasn't one of comfort or anger. It was a steady gaze that said, I see you. I know the mud covering you, but don't confuse my pain with your remorse. Quito fell to his knees, pressed his forehead to the ground. He cried like a forgotten child. He mumbled things he didn't even understand. I'm not my father. I'm not my father. ... He repeated it again and again like a broken mantra. Inside the house, Baraka heard everything. Leaning on the doorframe, his eyes filled with tears, but without the courage to step out. Deep down, his pain was even quieter. A wound that had never been named. The eldest son, raised to be the sword and shield of the chief, had never known affection. Later that same night, Baraka called the first girl into the kitchen. He was sitting on the floor, his sword tossed in a corner. When she entered, he said nothing. He just lifted his eyes, a look of someone carrying an invisible cross. He stayed there for minutes in silence until he finally said, My father killed everything in me. I have nothing to give. Not anger, not affection, only emptiness. She stood still, holding the wet cloth in her hands, the drops falling too. The ground like tears her face could no longer shed. There was no hug, no touch, only pain hanging in the air, thick as bonfire smoke. Meanwhile, Mosey returned from the woods. He came in through the back door, his face streaked with mud, leaves stuck in his hair. He found the third girl sweeping the floor. He walked past her without looking, but suddenly stopped. He turned, looked her in the eyes, and there, in that instant, there was a silent scream, a plea for salvation that didn't come in words, but he didn't stay. He turned again and went upstairs, locking himself in his room. That night, each of the sons broke. One collapsed in tears. Another confessed the emptiness he carried. The third fled into his own abyss. It was the first time the chief's empire of silence began to crumble from within. Because the sons were not soldiers, not heirs. They were living ruins, fragments of a rotten masculinity built on shouting and fear. And the girls, even wounded, still prisoners, saw in their eyes a raw truth. They were also victims, not only perpetrators. This realization didn't erase the pain, but planted a bitter seed of understanding. Like someone who realizes the monster also bleeds. The next day, the chief tried to maintain routine. He ordered breakfast, gave out commands, but the sons didn't. Obey Baraka stayed locked away. Quito vanished into the fields. Mosey didn't even show up. The chief shouted, cursed, broke a chair in the yard, but everything came back as an empty echo. That day, the girls realized the wall was cracking. They didn't yet know how or when they might truly escape, but they felt in the heavy air of the house that the beginning of the end had arrived, and that for those who had lost everything was a small victory. That night the three retreated to their rooms, each holding her own fear like someone holding a faint lantern in the dark. But now the darkness no longer seemed endless, because even if by a thread, they'd seen humanity in the eyes of those who once looked like stone in their souls. The pain, the anger, the abandonment still burned. But something else also began to sprout. Something that neither the chief, nor the chains, nor the burned letters could contain. The certainty that even the tallest wall can fall when the roots begin to push from below. And there that night the roots began to move. The days dragged on like chains scraping against stone floors. The big house seemed to breathe heavier. The hallways creaked at night as if carrying voices trapped within the walls. After the sons' confessions, the chief wandered like a wounded bull, banging his baton on the floor, spitting orders at no one, cursing shadows. The power that once seemed unshakable now trembled, but he clung to each crumb as if pride could patch the holes opening beneath his feet, while the chief crumbled inside. The three girls began to draw closer, no longer, only through glances or stifled sighs. The pain that had once been a wall between them now became a bridge. It was on a gray afternoon when rain threatened to fall that the first true meeting happened. The first girl was in the yard, washing cloth stained with blood, marks from one of the sons who, in a fit, had cut his own hand. The muddy water flowed through her fingers as if carrying away every bitter memory. Then the second girl appeared holding a basket of cassava. She didn't say anything, just came closer and placed her hand over the first girl's hand. The touch was light, but it burned like an ember. The third arrived soon after, bringing an old cloth to wipe her face. When she got close, the three looked at each other for an instant that seemed to last a lifetime. That was when the invisible wall between them finally fell. Without saying a word, they began to embrace. A crooked, trembling hug, full of wounds, but real. The first girl wept softly. The second trembled so much she could barely stand. And the third just held the two of them, breathing deeply, as if drawing courage from the depths of the earth. It was a cry that didn't ask for pity or salvation. It was a cry of recognition, of someone finally finding in the other the mirror of her own pain. After that embrace, nothing would ever be the same. They started to meet in secret in the yard behind the chicken coop at the back of the corral. They didn't talk much, but they learned to speak with their eyes with gestures. A quick glance could mean, "Be careful." A gentle squeeze on the arm could say, "Don't give up." A stroke on the hair was, "I am here." They started creating codes. Small pieces of cloth tied to gates, marks in the dirt, stones stacked in strange shapes. Each sign was a promise of protection, an invisible rope that united them. Even when apart, it was as if together they had discovered a secret language that only those who have seen the bottom of the well can speak. The second girl, once the most explosive, now calmed down beside the others. The fire still burned, but it had turned into a steady ember, warming instead of burning. The first, more introspective, began to smile, small but real when she saw her companions. The smile was crooked, but it was a seed. The third, the quietest, began to hum softly. Old songs she remembered from childhood. The melody floated in the air like a thread of light on a moonless night. The guards sensed something was changing, but didn't know how to name it. The chief, increasingly isolated, ordered them to watch. But what was being born among the girls was invisible to eyes that only understand brute force. What happened was a silent construction made of courage, hidden tenderness, shared memories. One night they managed to meet by the well where the moon reflected like a cracked mirror. They sat on the damp ground, shared a piece of raw cassava, chewing slowly as if it were a feast. As they ate, they spoke for the first time about who they had been before all this. The first girl told of her grandmother's yard, the smell of coffee, the mornings when she ran barefoot in the rain. The second spoke of her father, the songs, the river baths, the laughter she had before everything turned silent. The third told of Sundays at the fair, the smell of roasted corn, the swing hanging from the cashew tree. Each memory was a thread stitching up their wounds, reminding each one that there was still a piece of herself kept safe inside. After that night, they started saying goodbye to each other with a gentle touch on the shoulder. A simple gesture, but one that said more than any word. "I see you. I recognize you. I'm with you." Courage began to grow slowly like a root breaking through stone. It wasn't a courage of swords or screams. It was the courage of waiting, of firm silence, of resistance in the gaze. They understood that escaping was more than jumping over a fence. It was refusing to give up the soul, even if the body remained captive. And the chief, so busy trying to control his sons, didn't notice that in the darkest corner of the big house, Aslan army was being born. An army of 3 women armed only with memory, pain, and the decision not to die inside. The nights became less dark because in each room there was a living flame guarded in their chests. With each new dawn, the girls woke with steadier hearts, knowing they were no longer alone. And this silent union was the loudest scream ever heard in that house. A scream no one heard, but that made the walls tremble and the ground shift. In the darkness the chief created, the 3 found light in each other. And a woman who finds another woman in the middle of pain discovers a strength no man in the world can dominate. Thus, they were no longer just fellow prisoners but soul sisters. And from then on, every step they took would be taken together, even if their feet followed different paths. The days went by as if they were all one. The same dust, the same sad crowing of the roosters, the same smell of burnt porridge coming from the kitchen. But inside the big house, the world was changing without the chief noticing. The 3 girls, now united in a silent pact, moved with a care that looked like a dance. The chief wandered lost among his own shouts and the closed doors of his sons, while the village outside kept pretending it didn't see Dot, until on a cloudy morning, a figure no one expected appeared at the gate. An old man with a long white beard dressed in a simple rockcloth tunic holding a wooden staff carved with ancient drawings. He was the elder of the village, the healer, a man known for listening more than speaking, for seeing beyond what the eyes show. He never warned when he would come, nor asked permission to enter. He arrived like the wind, uninvited. When the chief saw him, he forced a tense, fake smile, like someone holding a snake by the tail. He opened his arms, called him inside. But the old man didn't rush. He stood still in the yard, sniffing the air as if searching for something in the wind. The guards grew restless. The maids hid behind doors. Silence took over, as if even the birds had stopped to listen. The elder entered slowly, his bare feet stepping firmly, his staff tapping in rhythm. He stopped right in the center of the yard, looked around, turned his face to the house. His small, deep eyes shone, but it wasn't a joyful light. It was a sad, heavy light from someone who's seen many souls get lost. "Chief, I heard there are new residents here," said the elder in a calm tone, but one that cut like a well-sharpened knife. The chief tried to laugh, explained with a trembling voice that the girls were wives chosen to purify the family blood. The old man just shook his head, his eyes never leaving the chief's face. Then, without asking, he began walking through the house. He entered the rooms, ran his hands over the walls, smelled the hanging clothes, stopped in front of the locked doors. In every corner, murmured ancient words, words that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The girls hidden peeked through the cracks, feeling a tremor in their chests. They didn't know if it was fear or hope. At one point, the elder stopped in front of the third girl's room. He closed his eyes, pressed his forehead to the door, breathed deeply, as if smelling a rotten root. Then he opened his eyes and struck the ground once with his staff. The sound echoed like assailant thunder passing through walls and souls. "Smell of a broken soul," he said, low, but so strong it seemed the whole house heard. The chief tried to interrupt, spoke loudly, ordered the guards to remove the old man, but no one moved. Not the guards, not the sons, not the girls. Everyone stood frozen as if time itself had stopped to listen to that man. The elder then returned to the yard. He looked at the sky, closed his eyes, and raised his staff. He stayed silent for a long time, as if speaking to something no one else could see. Then he opened his eyes and spoke with a voice heavy with truth. These girls were not cursed, as many say. They were freed from the weight of ungrateful families who sold them like sacks of corn. Freed from the lie you call honor. The whole village began gathering outside, drawn by the rumor of the visit. People with buckets in hand, shirtless children, old women with cloths wrapped around their heads. Everyone came to listen. The chief, now pale, trembled. The elder's speech was a whip, tearing through the facade of dignity he had built over the years. "You think imprisoning a woman is a sign of power?" The elder continued. "But the woman who survives abandonment, who holds back her tears in the dark, who still keeps good memories in her chest, that woman carries a strength no chain in the world can break." The girls, still locked up, listened to everything. Each word entered like ballon wounds, like fresh water on a drought day. It wasn't salvation. It wasn't a promise of escape. It was recognition. And for those who carry pain, being seen is already the first step to not dying inside. The elder turned to the crowd, pointed his staff at the house. "From today on, the truth lives here. Lees don't last when the roots have already cracked the ground. These girls are not a curse. They are living proof that the spirit cannot be sold, cannot be bargained, cannot be silenced." The chief fell to his knees. There were no more shouts, no orders, no threats, only the sound of his own weeping. Lo, ashamed, a man folded by his own ruin. The sons appeared one by one, heads down, unable to face the old man. Baraka dropped his sword. Quito hugged his own chest. Mosikrit silently, his face dirty with earth. The elder turned to leave. Before crossing the gate, he spoke without looking back. "Take good care of these roots. Whoever forgets to care for the root will one day find the trunk rotten." The village fell silent. Dust rose with the elder's slow steps, mixing into the still air, leaving behind a trail of truth impossible to erase. That day, the girls did not win freedom for their bodies, but they gained something greater, freedom of the soul. They gained the certainty that even if the whole world pretended not to see, there was someone who heard the hearth's silent scream. When night fell, the three met in the yard without needing to arrange it. They embraced in silence. The wind passed among them like an ancient chant. It was as if finally they could breathe. The night was dark, but there was no more loneliness, because once pain is named, it can no longer rule the heart. In that house, something had changed forever. The chief could try to reinforce walls, lock doors, but it was already too late. The truth, once planted, grows even in dry soil. And noon, not even the most powerful man in the village, can stop the root from seeking the light. After the elder left the big house, the air inside felt different. It was no longer that heavy, stagnant air that suffocated the chest and trapped the scream in the throat. Now there was a strange breeze, as if the walls themselves were breathing, slowly trying to understand what had just happened. The guards walked with short steps. Too afraid to lift their eyes, the maids whispered in corners, and the chief's sons hid in locked rooms. The chief, that man who once seemed like a wall, now wandered the yard like a stray dog. His hands trembled, his lips muttered incoherent words. Sometimes he shouted the names of his sons, Other times he ordered banquets for guests who would never come. He was a man stripped of his own authority, bleeding pride from every edge. The three girls, meanwhile, no longer hid. They walked with their heads held high, looking at the horizon with steadiness. It wasn't insolence. It was dignity returning to the body, taking up the spaces once occupied by fear. They passed through the hallways as if they no longer belonged to that prison. The body was still there, but the soul had already crossed the gate. On a suffocating late afternoon, the chief tried to gather his sons in the yard. He called loudly, sent messages through the servants. But no one came. Baraka sat near the well, staring at his reflection in the water, his face tired, eyes red from so much crying. Keto hid in the horse shed, hugging a saddle, murmuring confused prayers. Mosey climbed to the roof of the house and lay there, staring at the sky as if he wanted to escape to the stars. Their absence was a declaration. The father who had always commanded, who made and unmade destinies, now spoke to the wind. His voice echoed empty, hit the bushes, and came back without an answer. The girls met in the kitchen. The third girl, the quietest one, who always swept the corners and avoided looks, was the first to speak. The time has come. We don't need to run. We need to stay. We need to live. The other two at first hesitated. Instinct told them to run, vanish into the woods, follow any road. But there, deep in her eyes, there was a truth that burned. It was a different choice. It wasn't escape. It was occupation. It was telling the world, I am here, and I am more than what they tried to make me. The decision spread like fire in dry grass. The first girl, remembering her grandmother's yard, felt the strength of those old mornings return to her chest. The second, remembering the father who carried her to the river, understood that courage had always been inside her. That night they didn't sleep. They sat on the kitchen floor, sharing pieces of cassava, stitching dreams together in whispered words. They planned not an escape, but a future. They thought about what they could do together, what they could build if they stayed. It was as if, after so long, they were finally writing their own story with their own hands. When the sun rose, the three went out into the yard. The chief, disoriented, appeared on the porch. When he saw the girls united, a strange force seemed to rise in his throat, but it didn't come out. His body shook. His skin turned pale. He wanted to scream, but only a hoarse breath came out, as weak as the last flicker of a candle. The sons, seeing the girls there, felt shame lash at them like a whip. Baraka dropped his sword to the ground and turned to the woods, walking without direction. Kidded ran after the oldest horse, mounted it without a saddle, and rode off without looking back. Mosey jumped from the roof, fell to his knees, looked at the girls one last time, and walked away slowly, disappearing down the dirt road. The chief was left alone. The baton that had so many times been his weapon of power fell from his hands. He sat on the ground, his eyes lost like someone waking from a bad dream, and no longer knowing where they are. The maids looked at him with pity, but no one approached. The girls then started to clean the yard. They gathered pots, swept the ground, threw away remnants of old parties, opened windows that had been shut for years. Fresh air invaded the big house, carrying the smell of the fields, of wet mornings, of a new beginning. The village slowly began to approach. First came the curious children, then the women with colorful scarves on their heads. Men who once clapped for the chief now arrived with lowered eyes, not knowing what to say. Seeing the girls there, firm, standing, many lowered their heads. Some cried. Others just stood still, trying to understand the force that was blooming. There the elder appeared again, standing at the edge of the path. He didn't need to say anything. He just looked and nodded silently, like someone who recognizes the victory of a rout no one believed could break through the ground. That day, the girls made their final decision. They would stay in the village, but never return to the houses that sold them. The big house was no longer a prison. It was now a place of reconstruction. They had no gold, no title, no husband, but they had the strength of those who had survived the impossible. And so they became known as the Three Roots, a name given by the village women who upon seeing them began to believe that the feminine soul is a soil where no seed of oppression can survive forever. On the night that fell after that uprising, the three sat on the porch, looking at the clear sky, full of stars that seemed to smile. The silence was sweet, the air was light. For the first time in a long while, they breathed without fear, and together they understood that the greatest escape was not letting their essence be stolen, that the loudest scream was to remain, that the greatest victory was to exist despite everything. Daramrin. In that moment they were no longer just sold girls. They were whole women. Alive, strong women who, even broken, chose not to bow. And there, in the most forgotten corner of the world, bloomed the certainty that no chain can resist the power of an awakened consciousness. The morning that rose after the uprising felt like a different one. The sun rose calmly, painting the yard with a soft, almost maternal light, the smell of wet earth coming from the dawn's dew seeped into every crack, announcing a day that was no longer just another day. It was the first day when the three girls, now whole women, woke up as owners of themselves. Without the chief yelling, without guards watching, without orders on where to go or how to walk. The silence in the big house felt like an embrace. A different silence from Theon that used to suffocate them. Now it was a space for breathing, for rebuilding. The chief, defeated, stayed alone in his room, his face buried in his hands, drowning in his own rotten pride. No one went to comfort him. Noon tried to raise his voice again. Outside, the women started gathering pieces of wood, scraps of cloth, old pans. The first plan was born there, in the yard, where once only fear existed, to open a small community kitchen and a sewing workshop. It wasn't just for sustenance. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to transform the hands once forced to serve into hands that would create, nourish, return life. The first woman, with the deep gaze of someone who carried her grandmother's yard inside her chest, began to embroider cloths with designs of roots and branches. Each stitch was a silent prayer, a plea for protection, a reminder that even when uprooted, a root can sprout again. The second woman, with steady hands, began kneading corn dough, shaping little cakes, cooking thick beans on a wood stove. The smell spread, attracting the village women, who came curious, but left with tears in their eyes. It was food with the taste of embrace, of care, of soul. The third woman, the quietest, took scraps and began sewing simple dresses, but full of color. While she sewed, she softly hummed old songs that seemed to stitch together the broken pieces of her own heart. Each dress sold was like a scream of freedom that spread throughout the village. The village women started coming to the big house's yard. At first they came timidly with short steps, eyes lowered. Then they began arriving with bags of flour, eggs, fruit, pieces of cloth. The house, once a temple of fear, became a gathering place. Conversations sprouted like grass on wet ground. Men also came, but not with commanding eyes. They came as seekers. Some brought baskets of cassava. Others came just to listen to the stories. And each story told in that yard smelled of truth, carried marks of tears, and the warmth of a bonfire on a cold night. The families that once sold their daughters began to feel the weight of the village's silence. The contempt came like a strong wind. They could no longer walk through the square with their heads high. They were no longer invited to parties. Shame stuck to their skin like mud after rain. It was a punishment without screams, without blows. The worst of all, emptiness. The chief alone watched the transformation without strength to stop it. The sons had disappeared down the road, each carrying his own guilt. He was trapped in the house, surrounded by memories that betrayed him. Every corner of the room seemed to whisper the screams he had spread for years. Every closed door reminded him of the invisible chains he'd forged himself. With time, the village started calling the three women the three roots. They said only those with deep roots survive, and they even cut, sold, betrayed, not only survived, they bloomed. One afternoon, as the sun slowly said goodbye behind the mango trees, the three sat together on the porch. The first embroidered a cloth. The second braided dough for the cakes. The third sewed a yellow dress, the color of the sun. They exchanged calm glances. No words were needed. There, silence spoke. On the horizon, children ran free. Women laughed loudly, and the smell of good food mixed with the distant song of a bird. It wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. In that moment, each one knew they weren't saved from men. They weren't saved from pain. They were saved from themselves. From the risk of becoming shadows. From the danger of forgetting who they were. The camera, if there had been one, would show their hands moving slowly. Their serene faces, eyes full of stories, and the setting sun would illuminate their outlines as if telling the world. No one won one here, but no one here died insolence. The three roots firm, alive, vibrant, whole women. Even after so much, because in the end what remains is not the wound, nor the betrayal, nor the abandonment. What remains is the courage to stitch your own story with the thin thread of hope. And there in that gentle sunset, they understood that destiny may delay, but it never fails those who refuse to bow. And those who carry roots in their chest will one day bloom, even if the whole world tries to tear them.